All right, so today we're diving deep into Embraer.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at their 2024 annual report.
Cool.
Specifically, Embraer, huge player in the jet market,
For sure.
especially those, up to 150 seats.
Yeah.
They've actually got like a 29.1% market share
Wow.
based on, deliveries since 2004. So,
That's impressive.
yeah, pretty significant.
Yeah.
And I think, what we want to try to figure out today is how is Embraer balancing,
Yeah.
these kind of established strengths they have
Right.
across these different segments? They're in commercial aviation executive jets,
Mm-hmm.
defense and security,
Right.
and at the same time, how are they innovating and growing?
Yeah. Makes sense.
So we're going to kind of break down each of those business segments.
Okay.
Look at their financials,
Right.
see how they're delivering value to shareholders, and then kind of assess where they're going in the future.
Sounds good. Yeah. And just to kind of set the stage right off the bat, in 2024, Embraer brought in $6,394.7 million in revenue.
Wow.
And they closed out the year
Okay.
with a pretty hefty order backlog, $26.3 billion.
Huge. Yeah.
So that tells you right away they're operating at a pretty significant scale.
Yeah, for sure.
So I guess diving into the individual business segments.
Yeah.
Let's start with commercial aviation.
Okay, commercial aviation.
Uh-huh.
This is where their E-Jets E2 family comes in.
Yeah.
The E175 E2, E190 E2, and the E195 E2, targeting that 70 to 150 seat market.
Exactly.
So what's their approach?
Well, their strategy here really seems to revolve around offering what they call leading edge aircraft.
Okay.
So think mainline passenger comfort and performance.
Yeah.
But tailored to the needs of those regional low-cost
Yeah.
network carriers.
Makes sense.
They're constantly investing in that E-Jets program, too,
Okay.
really focusing on keeping operating costs low while maximizing passenger appeal.
Right.
So it seems like a pretty refined approach to market segmentation, going after airlines that value the specific capabilities of the E2 family.
Yeah, for sure.
But there's that interesting situation with the E175 E2,
Yeah, you're right.
where development has been paused for 4 years.
Yeah. What's up with that?
Yeah, so that pause is all because of those U.S. mainline scope clauses.
Right, right.
Those agreements that restrict the size and weight of aircraft that regional carriers can use when flying for the bigger airlines.
Okay.
And it doesn't look like those clauses are going to change until at least 2027.
So it's a waiting game.
Pretty much. And that's what's really limited the market for the E175 E2 in the U.S. for now.
Yeah, that makes sense. A regulatory hurdle really impacting their strategy there.
Yeah.
But, despite that, the numbers for the other E-Jets are pretty impressive.
Yeah, they are.
By the end of 2024, they delivered 779 of those original Embraer 175s
Okay.
with a backlog of 164.
Got it.
27 of the E190 E2s delivered with 25 on order.
Nice.
And then the E195 E2 is really showing some momentum.
1128 delivered and a backlog of 154.
It seems like the larger variants in the E2 family are gaining some real traction there.
They really are.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit
Sure.
and talk about executive aviation.
Okay.
Now, this portfolio includes everything from that entry-level Phenom 100EX
Right.
all the way up to that super mid-sized Praetor 600.
Yeah, a wide range.
What's the game plan in this segment?
So their strategy in executive aviation is interesting.
So,
It seems like they're focused on a streamlined portfolio
Okay.
that really doubles down on performance cabin comfort and, cutting-edge technology.
right, makes sense for that moment.
Yeah, and the success of the Phenom 300E is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
It was the most delivered light jet for the 13th year in a row in 2024,
Wow, 13 years.
and the top-selling twin jet across the entire executive jet industry for the 5th year running.
So they must be doing something right.
Exactly. That kind of consistent dominance doesn't happen by chance.
Right. It shows they really understand their customer base in that segment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a big part of their business, too.
Yeah.
It brought in 27.6% of their total revenue in 2024, which translates to $1,762.7 million.
So,
The delivery numbers in 2024 really drive that point home.
yeah.
10 Phenom 100s, a whopping 65 Phenom 300s,
Okay.
28 Praetor 500s, and 27 Praetor 600s.
Wow, that segment is clearly a powerhouse for Embraer.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a real bright spot for them.
It does.
Okay, so now let's move on to defense and security.
Right.
This is where we see things like the A29 Super Tucano and the KC-390 Millennium.
Right, two of their flagship products.
Yeah, so what are some of the trends and initiatives they're focusing on in this area?
Well, I think the most interesting thing here is the growing global adoption of their key defense products.
Okay.
Like you mentioned, the Super Tucano has now been sold to more than 20 countries,
Wow.
with over 290 units delivered as of the end of 2024. And the KC-390 Millennium is really gaining some serious international traction.
Yeah.
You've got Hungary getting their first aircraft in September of 2024.
Right.
South Korea winning a bid to the joint purchase by Austria and the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And the Czech Republic's recent order.
It's spreading fast.
It is. And it all points to this growing confidence in the KC-390 as a multi-role military transport aircraft.
Yeah.
It really seems like they have a competitive advantage in this specific niche of the defense market.
Makes sense.
But they're not just delivering existing products, they're also actively developing new variants.
Yeah, they're not standing still.
No, they're not. For instance, they're working on new versions of the KC-390 Millennium,
Okay.
including versions with in-flight refueling and even intensive care unit capabilities,
Wow.
like we saw with that Hungarian order.
That's impressive.
Yeah, they're clearly being responsive to specific customer needs.
Yeah.
And trying to make the aircraft even more versatile. And then there's that partnership with Saab to produce the Gripen fighter in Brazil.
Right.
That production line was inaugurated in 2023.
Okay.
And by the end of 2024, 3 of the 36 ordered by the Brazilian Air Force were already in production.
So they're thinking long term.
Yeah, this is a significant long-term initiative for them.
It sounds like they're building a wider defense capability beyond just aircraft.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
They're also involved in things like radar systems.
Okay.
Remember, the Centaur M20 completed its operational evaluation in 2024.
Right.
They're also working on land systems and modernization programs for existing military aircraft.
So they're diversifying.
Exactly. It's all about creating more revenue streams.
Yeah.
And reducing their dependence on any single product.
That's a smart strategy, especially in defense.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's switch gears again.
Sure.
Let's talk about services and support.
Okay.
Now, this seems like a critical area for building those long-term customer relationships
Yes.
and generating that recurring revenue.
You're absolutely right. Their focus here is all about making sure their customers are happy
Okay.
throughout the entire life of their products.
Makes sense.
They've got initiatives like the Executive Care Program,
Yeah.
which gives executive jet operators predictable maintenance costs.
Right.
And then there's the Customer Experience Program, which is designed to measure and respond to customer feedback.
Yeah, so they're actively trying to improve
They are.
based on what they're hearing.
Exactly. And they've had some notable wins in this area recently.
Like what?
Well, in 2023, they opened the first complete flight simulator for the KC-390 Millennium
Oh, wow.
at the Embraer Academy,
Okay.
which is super important for training pilots and ensuring they're ready to go.
Right.
They also extended that integrated logistics support contract
Okay.
with the Brazilian Air Force
Okay.
for their ERJ 135 Legacy 600 and AEW aircraft.
So they're keeping those planes flying.
Yeah, that shows there's a real ongoing demand for their support services.
Absolutely.
And on top of that, they've got OGMA in Portugal,
Okay.
which is an authorized maintenance center for Pratt & Whitney engines.
So they've got a global network.
Yeah, that significantly expands their global service reach.
Okay, so last but not least,
Yeah.
let's talk about sustainability,
Oh, right? A huge topic these days.
especially for aerospace.
Absolutely.
So what are they doing?
Well, Embraer is taking a pretty multi-pronged approach to sustainability.
Okay.
They've got the ERJ jet family,
Right.
which is exploring a whole bunch of different sustainable technologies
Okay.
for that 9 to 50 seat market.
Interesting. So they're looking ahead.
Yeah, it shows their commitment to a cleaner future for aviation.
Yeah.
And then there's their investment in EVE,
Okay.
which is focused on developing those electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, EVTOLs.
Right. The EV tools everyone's talking about.
Yeah, and the urban air traffic management system that's needed to make those work.
So they're not just building the vehicles, they're thinking about the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. And that positions them really well in that emerging urban air mobility sector.
Yeah, it's a smart move.
But they're not just focused on the future. They're also making changes in their own operations today.
Okay, like what?
Well, they've set these really ambitious environmental targets,
Yeah,
like achieving carbon neutrality across their operations by 2040.
that's a big goal.
It is, and they're already making progress.
Okay.
By the end of 2024, they'd reached 80% renewable electricity use
Wow.
in their Brazil and Portugal operations,
Okay.
with 100% solar and wind power in those locations.
So they're leading by example.
Yeah, and they're also improving the environmental performance of their existing aircraft,
Okay.
like with those upgrades to the E195 E2,
Right.
which have made it more fuel efficient
Okay.
and also the quietest in its class.
Wow.
They even had a successful test flight using 100% sustainable aviation fuel
Oh, wow.
in partnership with Pratt & Whitney.
So they're really hitting sustainability from all angles.
Yeah, they're taking it very seriously.
Right. Okay, so that was a really comprehensive look at their business segments.
Yeah, we covered a lot.
Now let's dig into the financials a little bit.
Okay.
We know their total revenue was $6,394.7 million in 2024.
Right, a big number.
Can we break that down a little further and see how those different segments are performing in terms of profitability?
We can, for sure.
Okay.
So if we look at gross margins, commercial aviation actually saw a nice increase to 9.0% in 2024,
Up from
8.0% in 2023.
Okay, so a full percentage point increase.
Exactly. And they attribute that to a better mix of E-Jet's E2 customers.
So are they getting better prices or maybe focusing on more profitable contracts within that segment?
It sounds like it. Yeah.
Okay.
And executive aviation also saw their gross margin improve,
Okay.
rising to 20.1% in 2024 from 19.4% the year before.
Okay.
So that's good news there, too.
Yeah, definitely. So
Yeah.
what drove that improvement?
Well, it looks like a combination of things.
Okay.
They sold more of their higher margin Praetor jets, and they also had an overall increase in deliveries.
So more volume and a shift towards higher margin products.
Exactly.
That's a good recipe for success.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about revenue and margins.
Well-
What about the cost side of the equation?
Okay, so in commercial aviation, their cost of sales and services did go up
Okay.
by 18.3%
All right.
to $2,008.9 million in 2024.
And what was the main driver for that?
It looks like the higher number of E-Jet's E2 deliveries.
So it's a volume thing,
Pretty much.
but the fact that their cost increase was less than the revenue increase
Yeah.
that contributed to that improved gross margin we were talking about.
Right. They kept costs under control even while scaling up production.
Yeah.
And it's a similar story in executive aviation,
Right.
where their cost of sales and services rose by 24.0% to $1,407.7 million.
Okay.
But again, that was lower than their 25.2% revenue growth in the segment.
So they're managing costs effectively across the board.
Yeah, it seems like they are.
All right. So another key metric we always keep an eye on is the order backlog.
Oh, yeah.
And we know the overall backlog was a substantial $26.3 billion.
Right. A really solid number.
What's the breakdown of that?
Well, within that, total commercial aviation accounted for 343 firm orders at the end of 2024.
Okay.
That includes 164 Embraer 175s,
Good.
25 E190 E2s,
Mm-hmm.
and 154 E195 E2s.
So they've got a pretty good pipeline of future business there.
That backlog provides them with some nice visibility into their future revenue.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, speaking of the balance sheet,
Okay.
what's their debt situation looking
All
like?
right. What's the debt picture?
Well, at the end of 2024, they had total debt of $2,491.1 million.
Okay.
Most of it was in U.S. dollars,
Uh-huh.
and a significant portion of it was at a fixed interest rate.
So they're managing their interest rate risk.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Good.
And importantly, they've said that they have enough traditional sources of funding
Okay.
to cover their expected working capital needs
Huh?
and their planned capital expenditures.
So it sounds like they're in a stable financial position.
Yeah, it does.
And you know something else that caught my eye
What's that?
was that they distributed $44.5 million in profit sharing
Yeah,
to employees in 2024.
that's right.
How do they determine that number?
Well, that profit sharing is tied directly to the company's free cash flow
Okay.
and their operating margin.
So it aligns the interests of employees with the overall financial health of the company.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so now let's talk about their plans to create shareholder value.
All right, this is what investors really care about.
For sure. So what are they doing?
Well, one key area is their share buyback program.
Okay.
In March of 2025, they repurchased over 1 million shares
Okay.
for 82.2 million Brazilian reais,
Which is about...
which is about 14.5 million US dollars.
Okay, so by buying back shares, they're reducing the number of shares outstanding.
Right.
And that can boost earnings per share
Yeah.
and potentially even the stock price.
Ex-
Okay, so they're also being proactive in managing their debt, it seems.
Oh, yeah. They've taken some significant steps there.
Okay, what have they done?
Well, in February 2025, they repurchased and settled $411.0 million
Wow.
of their outstanding notes,
Okay.
including a big chunk of those 2027 notes.
Okay.
So that reduces their future debt obligations
Uh-huh.
and their interest expenses.
Yeah, so that frees up more cash flow.
Exactly. And then in March of 2025,
Okay.
they fully settled that BNDES contract that was maturing in 2027,
Okay.
which had an interest rate of 5.49%.
All right.
And they didn't have to pay any prepayment penalties to do it.
So they're saving money on interest
Yeah, they are.
and reducing their overall debt load.
Exactly. These actions show they're really focused on strengthening their balance sheet
Okay.
and minimizing financial risks.
Yeah, that's smart.
It is.
And what about dividends?
Oh, yeah. That's another important way to return value to shareholders.
For sure. So what's their policy there?
So the decision on dividends is made by their board of directors
Yeah.
at each annual shareholders meeting.
All right.
And they base that decision on the net profit calculated according to IFRS
Okay.
in the parent company's financial statements.
All right.
Now, there is a mandatory distribution rule
Okay.
based on a certain percentage of either their net income or retained earnings.
Interesting.
And just a heads up for any non-resident investors,
Yeah.
any interest they receive on their shareholder equity might be subject to withholding tax.
Okay, so that's something to keep in mind.
Definitely.
So they've got this mix of share buybacks, debt reduction, and potential dividends as their main tools for creating shareholder value.
Exactly. It's a multifaceted approach.
It is. All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Embraer's 2024 performance,
Yeah.
it seems like they're navigating this complex global environment
For sure.
with a pretty clear and well-defined strategy.
Yeah, they're definitely not standing still.
They're not.
I think their resilience and the strong performance of their executive aviation and services and support segments are really impressive.
I agree.
And the growing momentum in their defense and security business is something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think their proactive approach to managing their debt
Mm-hmm.
and returning capital to shareholders through those buybacks,
Right?
those are really positive signs.
They are.
And, despite all the challenges in the global economy,
Yeah.
some pressures in specific markets,
Right.
they've got that strong order backlog,
Yeah.
and they're still laser focused on innovation,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in those areas of sustainability and future mobility.
Right.
So it seems like they're positioning themselves well for the future.
Yeah, it does.
It makes you wonder how their pursuit of both traditional aircraft
Yeah.
and these new disruptive technologies like eVTOLs,
Right.
how that's going to shape the whole landscape of air transportation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
It's going to be fascinating to watch how it all unfolds.
It really is. All right, well, thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate your insights. All right, that's it for today.
See you next time.
We'll see you on the next one.